evening, everybody. Maybe the lights could come up a little bit briefly, but in any event, I'm Carol Johnson. I'm the director of Amherst Cinema. And usually when I introduce a special program, I talk about what the cinema does and so on, but tonight I want to just say thanks in two ways. First, I want to thank you all, because I'm sure there are some members in here. I know there are some members. If you are, hold up your hand, please. Wow, that's impressive. Look around and thank those people, because they are the people that help make the cinema what it is. We get about 2/3 of what we need from ticket sales and concessions, and the other 1/3 is from memberships and donations. So we get to do special events like this one and show first-run films on 4 screens, 365 days a year, and so on. But the other form of thanks I wanted to express is to Nina Kleinberg. Yay. I know that some of you are fans of Nina, and we welcome you, and those of you who haven't heard her before, in for a real treat. This is the 3rd series that she has prepared talks on, and we're really grateful because Nina is a Hollywood veteran, moved to the Valley a number of years ago to enter a new career, but she never lost her love of film, and she stepped forward when we were getting started and offered to give talks, so we're really grateful. So all I really want to do is to ask you to join me in welcoming Nina Kleinberg.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so good evening and welcome to Print the Legend, a look at classic Western films from the 40s and 50s. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you that these films all took place around 150 years ago. And so during our time together, you can communicate with the outside world by smoke signals or Pony Express or telegraph, but please turn off your cell phones. They haven't been invented yet. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at some of the films that exemplify what were known as the classics of Western films. They were the films that I saw as a graduate student in the late 60s and early 70s in Los Angeles. They were the movies that influenced my generation of filmmakers. The title of the series, Print the Legend, comes from the end of one of John Ford's great Westerns, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. James Stewart has spent the movie talking about his career as a governor and a senator, and he tells this story about how he achieved power, and it's not really a glorious story at all. He tells it to a newspaper man, and this is the newspaper man's reaction.
Well, you're not going to use the story, Mr. Scott?
No, sir. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
He's right, Vance.
So what we're talking about are the sacred myths of the West, the stories we've told ourselves about the foundation of this country. And before I get started, let me ask you a question. What is a Western? If you look in Wikipedia will say that Westerns are stories set in the latter half of the 19th century in the American Old West, and they center on the life of a nomadic cowboy or a gunfighter. He has a revolver and a rifle, and he rides a horse. Recurring characters are Native Americans and bandits and lawmen, you know, the usual cast of characters. Very interestingly, they never mention women. Westerns are not about women for the most part. They're usually about the challenges of masculinity and the bonding among men that take place under stressful circumstances. And if they do talk about women at all, they're usually in 4 categories. You've got your virgin schoolmarms, you got your unmarried sisters and daughters, you got your respectable settlers' wives, and you got your whores. And essentially, women in Westerns are defined in their relationship to men. Wikipedia also goes on to say that there are other kinds of Westerns. There's space Westerns and spaghetti Westerns and German Westerns, and I went through a million lists of great Westerns, and I found one that actually listed Star Wars as one of the best Westerns ever made. So we're going to stick to just the kind of Westerns that we think of when we think of classic Westerns. They play out like morality plays. There's heroes, there's villains, there's a struggle of good versus evil, there's climaxes of violence, catharsis of death, and at least until the late 1940s, the good guys usually won. However, so we're going to look at just these classic Westerns. And they took place from about the end of the Civil War to 1900. So I'm going to walk you through what happened during those years. Then we're going to talk about the birth of the fledgling movie industry. And we're going to find out why Westerns were by far the most popular genre of film and television right up through the 60s. It's unclear who said this, "Go west, young man." There's some controversy. They think it was Horace Greeley, but it was clearly the advice given to the teeming masses crowding into the large cities of the East. Out west, a young person could find a new life for themselves. Really, westward expansion began the minute Europeans hit the East Coast. There was always more land, more resources, more room just beyond the setting sun. And within a generation, the Louisiana Purchase had pretty much opened most of the continent to settlement by Europeans. But this great westward migration was pretty slow until what? The discovery of gold in California. And within a couple of years, tens of thousands of people descended on California with gold fever. And they didn't just come from the East. They came from Europe, they came from Mexico, from South America, from China. They were runaway slaves. It was probably the first time in human history that people from all 5 of the big continents were in the same space together. And within a few years, the white Europeans had either outlawed or out-taxed anybody except whites from digging in the gold fields. And there was actually one of the first known mass exterminations, mass genocide of the Native American population. Then, of course, within a year or two, the large mining conglomerates came with their more advanced methods of mining, and they chased off the individual gold diggers who had to go find other places to dig for wealth. Within 3 years, California became a state. And with it came the idea of the West as a place where you could go to get away from the religious constrictions and the class restrictions that you had in the East. And it was the beginning of the idea of rugged individualism. But getting to the West was a challenge. You either came by ship or you came overland. And that was really slow. It could take you months to get to the West. There had been proposals for a transcontinental railroad starting in the 30s, but the North and South could never agree on a route. So it wasn't until the Civil War, when the North basically ran Congress, that they chose the northern route and began constructing a transcontinental railroad during the Civil War. Construction began in 1862, starting going west from Missouri and east from California. The first route was completed in 1869. These are some shots from John Ford's great silent film, The Iron Horse. And with the Transcontinental Railroad came not just people, but also the industries that relied on east-west transportation: livestock, agriculture, mining, later oil. And the tens of thousands of people who came west after the Civil War included Civil War veterans on both sides, emancipated slaves. They brought their old grudges, they brought their weapons, and what I think must have been a pretty healthy dose of post-Civil War PTSD. And everything was up for grabs: land, livestock. The settlers were far ahead of any government power to provide basic legal protections against violence and property grabs. And towns rose and fell depending on the extension of the railroads and the latest discoveries of gold and silver and copper and other valuable minerals. Now, what they found when they moved west in what was supposedly wide open, unclaimed territory were also Native Americans whose ancestors had lived on these lands for thousands of years. We're going to talk about Native Americans and their place in Western cinema in our third talk, The Searchers. Sure. So what happened is that North and South kind of got together in the now expanded cavalry, and they had a new mission, which was to rid the West of what they perceived as Indian savages from real Americans, i.e. white Americans. This scramble for land and civilization lasted less than 50 years. But in the post-Civil War era, we needed a new founding myth. Abraham Lincoln wanted us to bind up the nation's wounds, and westward expansion generated enough myths about who we were as a country to satisfy our second origin story. You know, the Greeks had their gods like Poseidon and Zeus, and those were our original gods, Washington and Jefferson. Then the Greeks had the Iliad and the Odyssey. That was their second round of myths. And I think the Western becomes our second round of myths. Or if we were British, it was, first we had King Arthur and then we had Robin Hood. But this was our new founding myth. It's what brought the country together. Now, one great contributor to spinning the Western myth was the almost exponential growth of literacy after the war. And free public education meant that there was an expanding population of looking for good stuff to read. And to meet this need, there was the invention of the so-called dime novels. Stories printed on cheap paper and sold for 5 or 10 cents, and especially popular were stories about the West, which seemed like could have been outer space. It was so far away from the vast multitudes living in the East. And these stories fueled their imagination. Then they began to discover old classics, like James Fenimore Cooper, who had written about the original frontier, and then Bret Harte wrote his wonderful works, and Mark Twain as well. So you had this increasing interest, but perhaps the most influential people, I think, in spreading this myth were these two people, Ned Buntline and William Cody. Buntline wrote dime novels. He met William Cody when Cody was shooting buffalo for the railroad workers, and he convinced Cody to change his name to Buffalo Bill and let him be the lead character in what became a series of over 350 dime novels. They went on the road together with a play, and then they invented Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. This was not some rinky-dink circus that went from small town to small town. They toured for 20 years. They reenacted stagecoach robberies and Indian raids, and Annie Oakley was part of it, and Sitting Bull was part of it. They toured Europe. They played this show for Queen Victoria and her son Bertie. They toured for all the crowned heads of Europe, and they sold the nostalgia of this somewhat invented, now historic past as the true story of the settling of the West. But there's one more character we haven't seen yet. The cowboys. Now, most cowboys were the folks who drove the cattle and worked as ranch hands. They were mostly underpaid, overworked, itinerant laborers, both from the north and the south, and I've seen figures as much as a third of them were probably people of color. There were women, and the work was long and hard and dirty. And then something happened that transformed their image. And most people think that what happened was this: Owen Wister's book, The Virginian. His cowboy is a Southern Civil War veteran. He's well-read, he respects women, he's true to his own moral standards, and he's a model of upright behavior.
Well, who's talking to you?
I'm talking to you, Tramper.
When I want to know anything from you, I'll tell you, you long-legged son of a...
You want to call me that? Smile.
Anybody recognize the young Gary Cooper there? The cowboy hero wears white, the villain wears black. He's quick on the draw, but he insists on a fair fight. And this is the character who our cowboys, on whom they were modeled. Now, what else was happening in the country right around this time? And what was happening was, overlapping this myth-making of the West, was the development of a marvel of technology. Edison did not invent the movie camera. He didn't really even invent the projector, but he patented a camera and a projector. And it was with this technology that we have the first known images of what was really a reenacted West. In 1903, you have the first real Western movie. And not only was it the first real Western, it was probably the first or one of the first real movies, in that it told a story. And that was this, The Great Train Robbery by Edwin S. Porter. It includes some incredible early innovations in the history, not just of Western films, but of films in general. They borrowed from the Lumiere brothers and animated an explosion. You had a superimposition of a moving background to simulate what it would be like to be on a train. You had a camera mounted on a moving object. These are all early film innovations. You had the reenactment of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and one of their early robberies. You had cutting away to action at another place that was taking place at the same time. All of these were inventions from this movie. And of course, the good guys win and the bad guys lose. And you also have what may be one of the first close-ups ever shot. and the first Western hero, Bronco Billy Anderson. Now, this movie was shot with cameras that were carefully patented by Edison, and anyone who wanted to create movies with his camera had to pay him a hefty fee for the right to use this technology. The Great Train Robbery was not shot out west. It was actually shot in the wilds of New Jersey near Edison's laboratory. And there's a lot of great stories about why the film industry moved to Los Angeles. Oh, they had 350 days of sunshine, and there was this great scenery out there. But the other truth is that they moved all the way across the country to get away from Edison and his armed guards who were enforcing his patents. And it's very true that the early film crews had their own armed guards to fight off Edison's goons. Now, of course, there's lots of reasons why the films were out there. There were thousands of cowboys and ex-cowboys and ex-Civil War veterans who lived in or near LA, and they served as actors and wranglers and stuntmen. And you didn't have to go very far to find crowds of people who could act in your westerns, and also vast stretches of land that could substitute for the entire Western landscape. Now, these Western, and here comes our next myth maker. These veterans of the Old West included these folks who you've heard of, the Earp brothers. They had spent the last 2 decades of the 19th century moving from boomtown to boomtown, setting up casinos and bars and brothels, and taking jobs as sheriffs and marshals to keep the peace for whatever corporate interest might be running the town. But Earp lived the last 20 or so years of his life in Los Angeles, and he made friends with some of the great silent Western stars. I mean, these were really his good friends. They were pallbearers at his funeral in 1929. And he was able to sell them his highly stylized version of the settlement of the West. And for these folks who were eager for true stories. And so his adventures were whitewashed into early tales of honorable sheriffs and great cowboys and grateful residents. Even his 30-second dirty shootout between 2 sets of corporate interests in Tombstone, Arizona, after his death got mythologized into the gunfight at the OK Corral. It was routinely assumed that when talkies came in, the West was dead. Westerns were dead because it would be too hard to shoot sound outdoors. But that was not true. You had our first talkie Western, and actually our first film of any kind that was a talkie and shot outdoors in 1928.
Drop your hands. Keep them up. For the love of St. Patrick, what's this? Everybody come out of the court.
It's the Cisco Kid.
Oh, there you are. Hold up, we're lucky if we get away with our lives.
Now, one of the things I love about this shot is that they really had trouble trying to figure out where to put the microphone early on. And that very odd plant there, has got to be where they hid the microphone. Even though this film was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, it didn't do well at the box office. It was wildly expensive to shoot high-class Westerns outside, in sound, and really in the 1930s, the market for big-budget, so-called A-Westerns declined. And what you got, Hollywood turned to B-Westerns. These were movies meant to just fill up the second half of a double bill. And as many as 300 of these were turned out in every year in the 1930s. Now, although John Wayne starred in many of these films, he did not achieve true stardom until 1939, when he made this film with John Ford. This was the movie that helped bring back big budget westerns. It was a western for grown-ups. And it had every trope that we would define what we love about westerns.
Hold it!
Oh, steady, ho. Hey, look, it's Ringo.
You had the good bad man, the guy who was wrongly accused of something and was out to set the record straight and take care of the bad people who'd done him wrong.
Doc, can they make a new town when I don't want to go? Do I have to
Now,
go?
Dallas, don't you go making no fuss.
Do I have to go, doctors, because they say so?
You had the drunken doctor, usually Irish in John Ford's films. John Ford could knock him back with the best, and his doctors were usually Irish, and they were usually inebriated. You also had the whore with the heart of gold.
Now, Dallas, I've got my orders. Don't blame these ladies. It ain't them.
It is them! Doc, haven't I any right to live? What have I done?
We're the victims of a foul disease called social prejudice, my child. These dear ladies of the Law and Order League are scouring out the dregs of the town.
And of course, you had your prudes and your bigots, which adds up to older, unattractive women. And then, of course, you had this
You wouldn't
this
understand,
fellow.
cowboy. You've never seen an angel, nor a gentlewoman, nor a great lady. I raised gentlemen.
Your impoverished Southern gentleman, and finally, you have my favorite character in this movie.
Why, they're even talking now about having bank examiners. As if we bankers wouldn't have to run our own banks. I have a slogan that should be blazoned on every newspaper in the country. America for Americans. The government must not interfere with business. Reduce taxes. Our national debt is something shocking. Over $1 billion a year. What this country needs is a businessman for president.
Well, we got him, didn't we? Okay. And of course, it had everything else we come to expect in Westerns.
It's the bugles. They're blowing the charge.
Shortly after this film was made, World War II began, and though Westerns were made during World War II, our national consciousness was elsewhere. After the war, when Westerns returned, they returned with a new level of seriousness and began to question some of these myths that had established Westerns as the fundamental statements on how we saw ourselves. Tonight's film is right on the cusp of this transition from the so-called expansionist Westerns, where we told and retold the story of European migration west, and psychological Westerns. They had the tropes of film noir, they were kind of dark, and there was more attention paid to the characters and the motivations of the main players. It's directed by Howard Hawks, who some people have described as the greatest American director, who is not a household name, although some people in the audience have already disagreed with me on that. He'd been a director since the silent era. He had directed comedies with Cary Grant, like His Girl Friday and Bringing Up Baby. The two films he made right before Red River were To Have and Have Not and The Big Sleep. And he would go on to direct many films you've seen, like the great science fiction film The Thing and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, a musical. Red River was his first Western, but it would not be his last. And it was he who decided to shoot in black and white. He wanted this to be a dark story, and he thought Technicolor was too garish. The screenplay was from a story by Borden Chase. His stories were always dark and violent, and Hawks needed some lightening of the material, and he brought in Charles Snee and worked on the script himself as well. John Wayne was not the first choice to play the lead role of Tom Dunson. They wanted Gary Cooper, and Gary Cooper thought that the character of Tom Dunson was just too mean and unsympathetic, and it would ruin his image. So they turned to John Wayne. John Wayne was still hovering between A and B Westerns and movies. He was 39 years old, and his biggest concern when he shot this film was that most of the time he was playing a considerably older man. The other lead is Montgomery Clift. He was a New York stage actor. He had never been in a film. He was one of the first graduates of Lee Strasberg's acting studio, the Method School of Acting, and he shared his fellow New York actors' disdain of Hollywood, which he called Vomit, California. But he also wanted to be a star, and he could see the potential of working with Howard Hawks and John Wayne. He had never ridden a horse, he'd never shot a gun, he'd never thrown a rope. He spent 2 months preparing for this. Now, after meeting Clift, the notoriously homophobic Wayne is said to have asked his secretary, "He's a little bit queer, don't you think?" And he later called him an arrogant little bastard. But for his part, Clift called Wayne and his hyper-masculine buddies a bunch of fascists. Nevertheless, this off-screen battle between old Hollywood and the Method School, I think, works great in Red River. Walter Brennan, you may remember him as the star of The Real McCoys on TV. Well, he'd been around for many years before this was shot. He was an old pal of John Ford and Howard Hawks, and he was brought in for comic relief because, again, Borden Chase's stories were just too dark. There's a little bit of love interest in the beginning and in the end. Joanne Drew was not the original choice, but the actress that Hawks wanted was 3 months pregnant, so she was out. The original character in the Borden Chase story was a prostitute, but that was never going to get past the censors. So who knows what on earth she's doing on that wagon train. No one ever mentions it. The music is by Dmitri Tiomkin. And, oh, there we go. And I'm not sure why that's not playing. Come on. There we go. Anyhow, Tiomkin was one of the great European composers who came to Hollywood and basically invented movie scores. This film has many of the themes that we've talked about this evening. You've got the idea that Western lands are the natural and rightful property of white Europeans, there for the taking. Native Americans are simply an impediment in westward expansion. Violence is necessary in a lawless land. But unlike earlier Westerns, it has even grander mythic themes, including little bits of Oedipus, Captain Ahab, and Mutiny on the Bounty. Please enjoy Red River.